elaborate a little more, and we did, of course, in this short paper, the concept of social ideas. I mean, what do you mean precisely with social ideas? When you mentioned, for example, right, for instance, or leisure. And yes, but then how do they transform into normative principle? Because in a sense, I could say leisure was transformed in a normative principle in the moment in which it was recognized that we have a right, for instance, to leisure. There is a right, for instance, when you reduce the working day to 8 hours, when you say you should have at least one day in the week in which you don't work, there was a way of transforming this social idea into a normative principle, even if indirectly. Am I right? I mean, is this the kind of process that you are trying to describe? Thank you.
I'd like to ask Miriam about the concept of recognition in Honneth and in Hegel. Do you think that this is the same concept? Because sometimes I think that Honneth, he takes the concept of recognition in Hegel, in the early Hegel, and then I think that it's not the mature Hegel's concept of recognition. If you agree with that, with this, and if you think that it matters for this kind of institutional recognition, if the concept of recognition in Hegel was not the right concept of recognition, if this young concept of young Hegel concept of recognition. E para o Luiz Bernardo, daí em português.
No, you can.
Okay.
Put the question in English.
Do you think
that
Sen took the concept of sympathy in Adam Smith, and if it matters for this kind of a new approach that he has about Smith, and if you think that Rawls lacks this concept of sympathy, and that's why he's decided by Zé. That's it.
Last but not least.
Tá bom, então acho que eu vou fazer a pergunta em inglês então pro... Qual é o seu nome, perdão?
Luiz Bernardo.
Luiz Bernardo.
Mas podem me chamar de Luiz.
Tá bom.
Luiz Bernardo.
No, because I don't know if you have you read Foucault's The Birth of Biopolitics? Because there's a very good critique that he addresses to Smith, and he says, because you talked about the interest, right? How interest is never individual. It comes from like interesse, right? It's what unites us. It's the very expression individual interest is I don't know. It's misplaced because it's something that's always social, and that's what you pointed this out in your talk. But Foucault has a very clever critique that he presents in the Birth of Biopolitics, in which he says that this idea that my individual interest is never purely individual because it's always connected with a broader sociality. This idea is never really proved. It's only it's like Smith takes this idea for granted. That's what Foucault writes in The Birth of Biopolitics. And since you are studying Smith, I'd like to know if you have an answer for that.
It's a puzzle.
Okay, and then my second question is for Sinatra, right?
No.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm terrible with names. But you talked about just something, you've mentioned reproduction as an instance of what you name interactive inequality, which, and you said that it falls outside the scope of law. And I don't know, maybe you're thinking about Chile, but I just wanted to tell you that in France, reproduction is legally regulated. Maybe, okay, medical assistance, right? Straight couples, they are granted medical assistance for reproduction, whereas same-sex couples are not. So here you have a very clear case in which reproduction is being legally regulated, and some citizens are being deprived or bereft of this right. I mean, I don't know if you can call that a right. Anyway, and my last question is about Hanif, because you said that one can only talk about growing inclusion if one presupposes the existence of excluded people, right? And I don't know, and you use this argument for proving the fact that Hanif has a putative atomism, and he is oblivious to the fact that people are always in a relationship, okay, even if it's a negative relationship. But maybe one could say that if new facets of identity spring up from subjects that are, of course, in relation to one another, then we could talk about a growing inclusion without necessarily subscribing to atomism. Social intercourse changes personal identity, and those changes claim for recognition and inclusion. It is precisely because human beings are not isolated, their identities change as they interact with one another, that they need growing inclusion. Okay? So, I don't know.
Vocês quiserem a ordem da resposta.
It's okay. I don't know if I'm capable to answer the 3 questions made by Nita, Maria de Lourdes, and yes, it's my revenge. Gustavo.
That's beautiful.
Okay. Valeu, Gustavo. So first, Nita, I would say that I'm very convinced of the distinction between this social choice approach and the rational choice approach, because exactly the fact that the relationship between self-interest and efficiency that you remarked is thought in a very narrow perspective in the rational choice theory. So the problem here is not self-interest in itself, but the fact that there is a kind of a narrow description. From a descriptive point of view, it's a narrow perspective, and from a normative point of view, it's simply wrong. Simply wrong. And I think that Martin shows very, very well this descriptive and normative failure. But the problem is not exactly what you said, that it's one thing or another, self-interest or efficiency. But the question is that efficiency must be thought not only from the point of view of self-interest. And I think this is a very important idea in Martin. And what I don't agree exactly with him is that you can't think in this way in a Rawlsian point of view. But that's another point that you okay. But from a Rawlsian point of view, this is true. An absolute lack of interest that you find in Rawls on all these moral theories based on emotions, moral sentiments. Rawls absolutely hates all this perspective. And Amartya says in a note, in a page, that the only phrase that he encountered in all Rawls' work about Adam Smith was something like he lived in the 18th century, wrote 2 books, and and died. Something like that. But I think why? It's more because Rawls is really interested in the contractarian perspectives, like Hobbes, for instance, and Kant. But you will not find, I think, in Rawls' theory of justice or even in his political liberalism a minor interest in this, and that's why Adam Smith tries to push Adam Smith in a perspective that puts it against the tradition, the background of which Rawls constructs his theory of justice. So you find not only Kant but also Hobbes, not only Rawls but also Nozick in the so-called institutional transcendental theory. And Gustavo, I really don't know how to answer your question. It's true that Smith takes for granted this, let's say, this social aspect of sympathy and so on. But I would put this question: who doesn't take for granted Foucault himself? I would put Adam Smith putting this question to Foucault. You know, I don't know if you understand what I mean. So that's the only answer that I can think in this moment. O pessoal entendeu minhas respostas? É o caso de eu falar rapidamente? Não. And for the English-speaking people, I'm sorry for reading my paper in Portuguese. But I was advised that there were not only Brazilians would be here today. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I have many questions that have to do with the question of res atomism, and if there is res atomism or not. The first question had to do with the concept of recognition and Honneth in Hegel. The first, no, but I'm going to start by this question. I wanted to say, yes, it's true that Honneth starts from the young Hegel, the Jena Hegel, and different, not a different concept of recognition, but this is the place in Honneth theory where intersubjectivity is emphasized and not structured in this teleological way which the mature Hegel would have, starting from the phenomenology of the spirit. No, it's not the concept some people associate when we talk about recognition. The question to the famous master-slave chapter of the phenomenology is not this concept, which is not normative at all. No? And it's the concept he finds in these early writings, and Honneth tries to find them again in the philosophy of right. It is present in the philosophy of right, but when you actualize the philosophy of right, you have to take care not to follow the teleological structure, and Honneth does that himself by showing that this structure would be, he calls that the over-institutionalization of the philosophy of right, the late Hegel work. So, yes, okay, he can neutralize that if we take into account this. That's what he does when he uses Hegel's later work. But he does start from the writings of Hegel in Jena. And it is, I think, if you consider this intersubjectivity-oriented writings from the early Jena Hegel, it is, yes, the same concept actualized, no? Because he uses George Herbert Mead and other people to transpose Hegel's concept to actuality. And of course he develops that further. He also takes the structure, the threefold structure of family, civil society and by Hegel, state constitution, or however we want to call it, which is actually one of the Hegelian insights in modernity. And he's the first one to see the role of the bürgerliche Gesellschaft, a separate space from the state and so on. Yeah, this is one question. The other questions have to do with the rest atomism. And the question if, well, please don't tell him, I have said that I know I am exaggerating, but it's not that. But I think he tends, of course, everyone knows it's not his intention to be a rest atomist. No? He is actually, he has a conception of liberty and of justice which is actually intersubjectivistical. I'm always calling intersubjectivistical, I don't know if this adjective exists, but it's the way I think we have to call it. The problem is sometimes I think he falls back into rest atomism without noticing it. The question of inclusion, of course, when you talk about a growing inclusion, we could already think he is aware of the fact himself that people are already included. But I would say he is, and sometimes I think there are points where it seems he loses a little bit the side of it. I think he emphasizes a little too much, especially from the beginning of his work to more recent works, but so only, well, I don't like the change from solidarity to limestone, you know? I think he emphasizes even more the question of individual freedom, and he tends to be a bit more liberal if he doesn't take care, you know? I don't know, but there is a risk there, and the risk, I think, is due to the fact that sometimes he does think of individual subjects as something that is created through subjective relationships and then end up being individual subjects, a little bit detached, more detached than they should from the relationships they are constituted in. No? Yeah, the question would be also if there are even groups which are completely excluded. Now, if we think the relationship of misrecognition also as a relationship, it's also a problem. Yes, it is descriptive and normative as well, his theory, but sometimes he uses the word recognition in a very only normative way. Then sometimes it sounds very normative. And then we would have to say these people are not recognized. But if you say, that's why also I was making this distinction, you have these intersubjective relationships, which normatively seen are relationships of recognition. But you have anyway intersubjective relationships if we start from this, well, social ontological position that people are not isolated atoms. No? Well, in this case, if we start from this point of view, there are not even groups which are not accepted or completely excluded. Then maybe the word inclusion is not the best word to describe this. I know Rone doesn't say people are absolutely detached, but there's something there I think that could bring to this result, that there is still a rest of individualism there that I think is not, doesn't follow from an intersubjectivity-oriented theory. In his sense, very concrete intersubjectivity-oriented theory. That's the point also where if even the negative relationships of recognition are relationships, then if you don't see them in relationships, you fall back automatically in something like an atomism. Because, yeah, once I wrote something like that, recognition, even the most misrecognized person, well, I had a bad example there, but an example of something which was absolutely not recognized, but it's not absolutely not recognized. I said, even this is recognition. And he put a Fragezeichen. So that's when I suspect he thinks of the theme as more normative than descriptive, although he is descriptive and normative. But then if you say, Marek, that you think I am right when I say that the questions of, so normatively, the question of the more demanding norms, I think you mean the process of transformation of social norms and this Überschuss, widening of the recognition. But not descriptively, because people describe themselves when they talk about equality and freedom as equality connected to freedom. It could be, but people also talk about individuals. It's a very, the most common position in modern laws is to think about oneself as an isolated individual. That's the point, if this position is correct as well. And the fact that they connect equality to freedom, which is really what most people do in modern societies, might be also a consequence of the fact that they don't see themselves as related to each other, and they see themselves as less related to each other than they actually are. That's my point, so to say. I don't think equality is just because of individual freedom, unless you put the last ends of society on individual. If you think it's society, you cannot say what comes first, the egg or the chicken, or how to say that, the egg or the hen. No? So you have both at the same time. You cannot say it's everything oriented so that individuals have freedom, but the context is as important as the individual result, and the result is not without the context. So you have to think of both as interwoven. So you couldn't make the distinction and put equality as a means to have equal freedom. That's the point I think that fails. I don't know if I have answered the different aspects of each. I think so. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, to start, I was talking about social ideals. You know, well, you know, my paper starts from the question. There is a question always about normative principles. How do they work socially? Because you can discuss about that in an abstract way, but then you have to answer, how are they created, how they are transformed, and how do they actually work to orient individuals and institutions? And when you do this question from a sociological point of view, then you have to find out how the gap between a normative abstract principle becomes an active instrument of influence of action. And what I wanted to point it out, that this question is a very important question, and an answer, what I think I found, I theoretically throughout my research, is that we have to use the concept of social ideas, because if not, we're not going to understand how these normative principles act and how they are produced and how they are transformed. It's only ideas that work in individuals. They orient the action of individuals, not a normative, abstract sentence. I don't act in the social world because equality, I don't know, or because a normative idea of equality, it has to do with some ideas that I inscribed in myself, and then I orient my actions. So this is why I am insistent that we cannot think of normative principle without thinking about social ideas. It's just that not every social idea has to do with normative principles. I mean, that organize a society. I am taking it from a sociological perspective too. When I said this is a true normative principle, I'm saying this is working in this society, and institutions are taking in account this principle to organize themselves and individuals too. there are social ideas like women must be skinny, tall, or blonde, but they're not. They act as social ideas. They are not normative principles. It's just this difference that I wanted to point it out, and it's leisure, of course, and just to say quickly, but this, what you have asked, opens a lot of problems too, because the problem behind your question, and I don't have an answer yet, is the fact that there is a hierarchy of normative principles. There is a hierarchy. And so when do you say that this is a true principle, a normative principle? Or what does Habermas meant when he said this is a true social normative idea? What is he saying? He's using true because he knows that there is a hierarchy and we have to distinguish them, and we still don't have analytical tools to make a distinction of what is a true normative idea. What are we saying by that? What is a normative principle? In which level are we going to put that? I don't have an answer, but I am sensible that to the fact that your question is going in that direction, or should no? And about interactive inequalities, I wasn't talking about reproduction. I was talking. I know you were. I was talking about the reproduction, maybe of interactive inequalities. But your point was that I said that it doesn't. Well, it goes beyond the scope of law and institutions. And what I wanted to point it out is that I can. Like in the hotel we are now, build a shelf, and to say in this elevator can everybody come and there is no discrimination, but it is hard to regulate if somebody is talking with you and is looking at it ironically, or is just using a kind of tone when he's talking to you that's not exactly the same tone. That is the tone that he uses when he's talking to the boss. So you cannot regulate this. But these things are very important to the perception of people of inequality. And that's what I'm trying to underscore. In Chile, this is something that is happening, and I'm sure it's happening here too, because the promises of equality have been understood as promises of equal treatment in social current interactions. But you cannot do laws that oblige me to love you, or to have a lot of esteem for you, or not to speak with you, or not to look at you in some way. There are no laws for that. So there are demands, social demands, that cannot be yet politically articulated. And that is the point. What are we going to do with that? So my case in equality, what I wanted to underscore, and I'm going to finish with that, is that it's a nice case, the case of Chile, I don't know the case here, because what we are seeing is that equality is not a long term, it's not a transformation historically in long term, but we are seeing a transformation ongoing now, and that is opening a new domain, and it's opening then new questions, new political questions, and new questions for how do we deal with that? I mean, we can write that we want a good treatment, equal treatment like Conant has, but how do we deal with that socially? Well, that was it.
Obrigado, então. Fazemos um intervalo de 25 minutos. Retornamos. Obrigado.